innocent beauty melts the ruthless CEO one night, and he's helplessly obsessed forever. Hello, dear family. Welcome to today's beautiful and heart-touching love story. I am so incredibly happy to have you here, and I want you to know that this channel is a place where love, emotions, and unforgettable romance come to life. Whether it's your first time here or you've been with us for a while, I welcome you with open arms and a heart full of gratitude. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to send a beautiful prayer just for you. May your heart always be filled with love, your days with happiness, and your nights with peace. May success follow you wherever you go, and may you always be surrounded by people who cherish and respect you. Whatever struggles you are facing, may they turn into victories, and may you always find light, even in the darkest moments. You are loved, you are precious, and you deserve all the happiness in the world. Now tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? I would love to know which part of the world you are tuning in from. And before we dive into today's extraordinary love story, I have one special request for you. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything, and it helps us bring you more heartwarming, breathtaking love stories filled with passion and deep emotions. So hit that subscribe button, turn on the notifications, and let's keep this journey of love alive together. Now, let's begin today's beautiful and unforgettable story. Phillips Lancaster was a name that sent shivers down the spine of competitors, a man whose mere presence commanded the room, whose sharp blue eyes could make the most seasoned businessmen stutter in their speech. He was ruthless, unshakable, and entirely indifferent to anything outside the realm of power and profit. Love, emotions, attachments, these were trivial distractions in his world, unnecessary burdens that only the weak entertained. At 32, he had built an empire that stretched across industries, ruling the corporate world with an iron grip, his name synonymous with success and fear. Yet, despite all his wealth and influence, he found himself standing at the grand altar of the Lancaster estate, facing a fate he never imagined he would succumb to. Marriage. Not out of desire, not out of choice, but out of obligation to a billion-dollar deal that even he couldn't refuse. His grandfather, the last true authority Phillips had ever respected, had made it clear: marry or lose the empire he had spent years building. And so here he was, standing like a sculpture carved from cold stone, waiting for the woman who was about to become his wife. The grand hall was filled with the city's elite, whispers echoing through the air as guests marveled at the event. It wasn't every day that Phillips Lancaster, the most unattainable bachelor, surrendered to marriage. Women who had spent years trying to catch his attention now watched in envy, their gazes shifting towards the veiled bride as she walked down the aisle. Alika. That was her name, a name he had barely acknowledged until this moment. She was nothing like the women he was used to, those polished, cunning socialites who wore their ambition like armor. Instead, she was soft, untouched, a delicate contrast to his world of steel and fire. He had barely looked at her before today, treating the arrangement as nothing more than another business contract, another chess move in his never-ending pursuit of power. But as she took slow, measured steps toward him, her presence wrapped in an aura of innocence and quiet strength. Something in Phillips shifted, something foreign and unwelcome. The moment she stopped before him, standing so close he could hear the soft tremor of her breath beneath the delicate veil, he felt it, an unfamiliar unease stirring deep within him. His fingers twitched, clenching into a fist at his side, as he reminded himself this was just a transaction, a necessity, nothing more. Yet, when the officiant signaled for him to lift her veil, his hands moved slower than they should have, hesitation betraying his iron will. As he reached forward, fingertips grazing the sheer fabric, time seemed to pause, the world narrowing down to the space between them. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he lifted the veil, revealing the face of the woman who would bear his name. Phillips was a man who prided himself on control, on his ability to remain unaffected. But in that moment, he felt the sharp, unexpected punch of something dangerously close to fascination. Alika's beauty was breathtaking, not in the practiced, calculated way of the women who adorned the high society he knew, but in an ethereal, untouched way that made something inside him tighten. Her large, doe-like eyes, framed by thick lashes, were filled with uncertainty. Her full lips slightly parted as if she, too, was bracing herself for this fate neither of them had chosen. Her skin, a warm, rich brown, was flawless under the golden glow of the chandelier, a stark contrast to the coldness of his own world. There was an innocence in her gaze that unsettled him, a quiet strength that both intrigued and irritated him. Phillips had expected to feel nothing, to remain as indifferent as he always had. But as he stared at Alika, standing before him in a wedding dress she never asked for, something inside him flickered, something unrecognizable and entirely unwelcome. It was just a trick of the moment, he told himself, an illusion brought on by the grandeur of the ceremony, by the weight of the expectations pressing down on him. And yet, as she blinked up at him, as her lips parted ever so slightly as if to speak, but no words came, his pulse did something it had never done before. It skipped, just once, just enough for him to notice. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, Phillips Lancaster, the cold-blooded billionaire who had never faltered, felt the first crack in his carefully controlled world. The grand bedroom of the Lancaster estate was bathed in the soft, flickering glow of candlelight, the golden hue casting long shadows over the elegant furnishings, the massive four-poster bed, and the delicate silk curtains that swayed ever so slightly in the night breeze. Phillips stood near the window, his tall frame exuding an air of cold indifference as he loosened the cuffs of his pristine white shirt, his sharp jaw clenching ever so slightly. This night meant nothing to him. It was merely an obligation, a consequence of the deal that had forced him into this marriage. He had no interest in playing the doting husband, no desire to indulge in the romantic expectations that others might have for this night. His heart was a fortress, his emotions buried beneath layers of ice, and he fully intended to keep them that way. Behind him, Alika sat on the edge of the bed, her delicate fingers gripping the fabric of her wedding gown, her posture hesitant, uncertain. She was breathtaking in a way that was both innocent and haunting, her brown skin glowing under the candlelight, her dark curls cascading down her back like waves of midnight silk. Her eyes, large, deep, and filled with an innocence that unsettled him, watched him cautiously, as though she wasn't sure what to expect from the man she had just married. Phillips had seen countless beautiful women in his life, women who draped themselves in diamonds, who spoke in honeyed tones and moved with practiced seduction, yet none of them had ever made his pulse falter the way Alika did with just a single look. It frustrated him. He had convinced himself that he would be unaffected by her presence, that he would simply go through the motions of this arrangement and move on with his life. But the way the candlelight softened the contours of her face, the way her breath hitched ever so slightly when he turned toward her, sent a strange, unfamiliar sensation curling through his veins. He told himself it was merely curiosity, that the flicker of interest was nothing more than an appreciation for aesthetics. But deep down, something in him knew better. He could feel the shift, the slow unraveling of his carefully controlled world, and it infuriated him. "You should rest," he said, his voice colder than he intended, his gaze flickering to the massive bed as he attempted to put distance between them, to re-establish the walls that were dangerously close to crumbling. Alika hesitated before nodding, her delicate fingers moving to the heavy pins in her hair, attempting to undo them. Phillips turned away, determined not to watch, not to let himself be drawn into whatever strange spell she seemed to cast, without even trying. He moved to the bar, pouring himself a glass of whiskey, hoping the familiar burn would ground him, would remind him of who he was, a man who did not fall for innocence, who did not allow himself to be consumed by beauty. Yet, as he brought the glass to his lips, something made him glance back at her, and what he saw sent a jolt through his entire being. Alika, unaware of his gaze, had finally let her hair down, the thick, dark curls tumbling over her bare shoulders like cascading ink. She had removed the heavy layers of her gown, now draped in a simple silk nightdress that clung to her slender form in a way that was entirely unintentional, yet devastatingly effective. The candlelight kissed her skin, casting a golden glow over every delicate curve, and when she sighed softly, the sound barely audible, Phillips felt something dark and possessive coil deep within him. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to look away, but it was already too late. The image was burned into his mind, seared into his thoughts in a way that he knew he would never escape. His fingers tightened around the glass as he fought the unfamiliar sensation clawing at his chest. He had always been a man of control, of discipline, yet in this moment, he felt neither. His entire life had been structured around power, around making decisions that served his empire, but standing here, watching his new wife in the dim glow of their wedding night, he realized that some things could not be controlled. He had intended to ignore her, to treat this night as nothing more than another transaction. But as she turned slightly, her innocent gaze meeting his, something inside him shifted. Alika's eyes were wide, unguarded, her expression unsure, yet filled with a quiet strength that made his breath catch. She wasn't trying to seduce him. She wasn't like the women he was used to. She wasn't playing a game, wasn't manipulating him with practiced charm. She was simply there, real and untouched, and that terrified him more than anything. Because for the first time in his life, Phillips Lancaster felt something other than cold ambition. He felt obsession begin to take root in his chest, dark and consuming, whispering that he would never be the same again. Morning arrived with a golden glow spilling through the grand windows of the Lancaster estate, painting the room in warm hues. But Phillips Lancaster felt nothing but cold. He sat at the edge of the bed, his gaze locked onto the polished marble floor, jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Last night had been a mistake. He had allowed himself to be affected, to feel something that had no place in his life, and that was unacceptable. He needed to shut it down before it went any further. His mind screamed at him to reclaim control, to put back the distance he had foolishly let slip between him and the woman who now bore his name. With a sharp breath, he turned his head slightly, eyes landing on Alika, who was still curled beneath the silk sheets, her dark lashes fluttering slightly as she stirred in sleep. The soft rise and fall of her breath, the way her delicate fingers clutched the fabric as if seeking warmth. It did something strange to his chest, something he refused to acknowledge. He forced himself to look away, to harden his heart against whatever strange pull she had on him, because he would not be that man, the kind who allowed emotions to dictate his actions. He stood, moving across the room with calculated precision, every movement controlled as he reached for the cufflinks on the dresser. The slight clinking sound must have roused her, because Alika shifted, her movements slow, hesitant, before her deep brown eyes fluttered open, still dazed from sleep. Phillips felt that unwanted sensation strike again, tightening around his ribs as she looked up at him, vulnerable yet mesmerizing in the soft morning light. He swallowed hard, ignoring the way his pulse picked up, and turned away before she could fully take in his expression. "Get ready." His voice came out clipped, distant, and when she sat up slightly, her brows drawing together in confusion, he knew he needed to end this moment before it became something he couldn't handle. "I don't want you to get the wrong idea about last night," he said coldly, buttoning his cuffs without sparing her another glance. "This marriage is nothing more than a contract, and I don't intend for it to be anything beyond that." He could feel the air shift, the warmth of the morning seeming to dull as silence settled between them. When he finally looked at her, he saw the way her fingers tightened around the sheets, the way her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but she didn't. She simply held his gaze for a moment too long, her eyes searching his as if trying to find something real beneath his carefully placed walls. And that made something inside him snap. "I will provide for you. I will ensure you have everything you need, but do not expect anything else from me, Alika," he continued, harsher this time, needing to make her understand. He saw the way her face fell just slightly, the way the light in her eyes dimmed, and something ugly twisted inside him at the sight. He was hurting her, he knew that, but he had no choice. This was how it had to be. She couldn't get close. She had to remain nothing more than a presence in his life, not a part of his soul. Alika, to her credit, did not argue. She did not plead or demand answers, nor did she lash out at his cruelty. Instead, she nodded slowly, her long lashes lowering as she murmured, "I understand." And that was what unsettled him the most. Her quiet acceptance. She should have fought back, should have thrown his words at him, but she simply took it, and that made him feel like the villain in his own story. He should have felt relief. Instead, a strange heaviness settled in his chest as he turned away, his fingers gripping the edge of the dresser. Why did it feel like he had just made a mistake? Pushing her away was supposed to make things easier, was supposed to remind them both of what this marriage was. A business arrangement, nothing more. And yet, as he walked out of the room, leaving her behind in that vast, empty bed, his body felt tense, his mind clouded with something he refused to name. He went through the motions of his morning, dressing in his tailored suit, stepping into his sleek black car, arriving at his office with the same precision he always did. But something was wrong. He sat behind his massive desk, fingers tapping against the surface, eyes scanning the endless emails flooding his screen. But none of it held his focus. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her. Alika lying in bed, her soft curls spread over the pillow, her brown skin glowing in the sunlight, her lips parting as if she had wanted to say something, but chose silence instead. His chest tightened at the memory, frustration clawing at him. Why couldn't he stop thinking about her? He had built his entire life on discipline, on shutting out emotions, yet one woman had managed to shake his control in a single night. It was absurd. It was infuriating. And yet, every time he pictured her, something possessive coiled inside him. He wanted to tell himself it was just irritation, that it was the newness of the situation, but deep down, he knew better. Because despite every warning he had given her, despite the distance he had tried to put between them, one truth remained. His heart was already refusing to listen. The Grand Gala was a spectacle of wealth and power, an event where the elite of the business world gathered in shimmering gowns and tailored tuxedos, their conversations laced with hidden agendas and veiled power plays. The chandeliers above cast a golden glow over the marble floors, the air filled with the soft hum of violin music and the clinking of crystal glasses as champagne flowed endlessly. Phillips Lancaster stood near the bar, his sharp gaze scanning the crowd with calculated indifference, his presence commanding even in stillness. He had never enjoyed these events, pointless small talk, forced smiles, and the constant game of who held more power. But attendance was necessary to maintain alliances, to solidify his empire. He took a sip of his whiskey, his expression unreadable, but his mind was elsewhere, pulled toward a presence that he could not seem to ignore, no matter how hard he tried. Alika. His eyes found her with unnatural ease, drawn to her the way a moth was drawn to flame, despite every effort he had made to remain indifferent. She stood across the room, wrapped in a silk gown that complemented the warm brown of her skin, her hair cascading in soft waves over her bare shoulders. The dress was not overly revealing, But to Phillips, it was too much. Too many eyes lingering on her. Too many men daring to steal glances at what belonged to him. He told himself he didn't care. He told himself he had no right to care. But when he saw the young entrepreneur standing far too close to her, a charming smile playing on his lips as he leaned in slightly, something inside Phillips snapped. His grip on the glass tightened, the ice clinking sharply against the crystal as his jaw locked in place. Who the hell was he? The man, Nathaniel Carter, a rising name in the tech industry, was speaking to her with a level of familiarity that Phillips immediately despised. His body angled toward hers, his posture too relaxed, his smile too easy, and worst of all, Alika, his wife, was smiling back. It was a polite smile, nothing suggestive, nothing inappropriate, yet it infuriated him beyond reason. Phillips had spent his entire life controlling his emotions, suppressing any unnecessary distractions. But at this moment, as he watched another man bask in Alika's attention, he felt rage coil through him with a force that startled even himself. His chest tightened, heat rising up his spine, his vision narrowing as Nathaniel laughed at something Alika had said, his hand brushing against the fabric of her sleeve in a way that felt entirely too casual. The sight was unbearable, unacceptable. No one touched what was his. Without a second thought, Phillips set his glass down with a sharp clink, his movements deliberate as he strode across the room, his presence cutting through the crowd effortlessly. People moved aside instinctively, sensing the storm brewing beneath his carefully composed exterior, but his focus remained locked on her. Alika, unaware of the storm she had unknowingly unleashed, turned slightly as Phillips approached, her expression shifting from mild surprise to uncertainty when she saw the intensity in his eyes. Before Nathaniel could react, Phillips had already positioned himself beside her, his hand pressing possessively against the small of her back as he pulled her just slightly closer. A silent, undeniable claim. "Mr. Carter," Phillips said smoothly, his voice a controlled blade, slicing through the air with unmistakable authority. Nathaniel blinked, momentarily taken aback by Phillips's sudden presence, before regaining his composure. "Mr. Lancaster," he greeted with an easy smile, though there was a flicker of something cautious in his gaze. "We were just discussing—" "I'm sure you were," Phillips cut in, his grip on Alika's waist firm but not painful, though she stiffened slightly at the unexpected contact. "However, my wife doesn't entertain pointless conversations with strangers for too long." The emphasis on wife was deliberate, a warning, a claim, a statement that left no room for misinterpretation. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, clearly catching the underlying meaning, but instead of pressing further, he lifted his hands slightly in a gesture of surrender. "Of course," he said smoothly, stepping back with an easy-going chuckle, though Phillips could see the curiosity lingering in his gaze. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Alika." Phillips didn't acknowledge him as he walked away. His focus was solely on her. Alika turned to him, confusion flickering in her deep brown eyes, and when she shifted slightly under his touch, he realized just how close he had pulled her. His fingers splayed against the delicate curve of her lower back, her warmth seeping through the fabric of her gown, and for the first time he noticed the way her breathing had quickened ever so slightly. He should have let go. He should have stepped back, put the distance between them that he had so ruthlessly enforced since the beginning. But he didn't. He couldn't. Was that necessary? Alika's voice was soft, uncertain, and yet there was something else beneath it. Curiosity. Phillips studied her, his stormy gray eyes tracing the delicate angles of her face, the faint pink on her cheeks, the way her lips parted ever so slightly as she waited for an answer. He didn't have one. Or rather, he had an answer that he refused to acknowledge. Why did he care so much? Why had the mere sight of another man near her ignited something dark and unyielding inside him? He had told himself that this marriage meant nothing, that she meant nothing. Yet the thought of anyone else looking at her, talking to her, touching her, made his blood boil in a way that both infuriated and fascinated him. He exhaled sharply, finally, reluctantly, releasing his hold on her, though the warmth of her lingered on his fingertips. "Stay close to me," he said instead, his voice lower than he intended, rough with something unspoken. Alika's eyes searched his for a long moment, as if she could see something he wasn't ready to admit. And then, to his utter frustration, she simply nodded, offering no argument, no resistance. Just that quiet, accepting presence that had always unsettled him. Phillips clenched his jaw, his gaze shifting back to the crowd, but the damage was already done. Because for the first time in his life, he had felt something completely out of his control. Possessiveness. And the worst part? It felt dangerously natural. The storm raged outside the countryside mansion, the wind howling like a beast in the night, rattling the ancient windows and making the candle flames flicker with each violent gust. Rain lashed against the glass panes in an unrelenting fury, the sky above splitting apart as lightning flashed, illuminating the vast, dimly lit living room where Alika and Phillips found themselves stranded for the night. The storm had come unexpectedly, cutting off their return to the city, leaving them with no choice but to stay in the grand but eerily silent mansion, far removed from the bustling world they both knew. Phillips stood near the fireplace, his broad frame casting a long shadow against the stone walls, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored black slacks, his posture exuding its usual cold detachment. He had been silent for most of the evening, lost in thoughts he refused to acknowledge, but his focus remained unshakably fixed on her, the woman who had somehow become an inescapable presence in his mind. Alika sat curled up on the deep leather couch, her delicate fingers clutching a silk throw blanket around her shoulders as she stared into the fire, her eyes reflecting the warm glow of the flames. She was breathtaking without even trying, her long, dark lashes casting soft shadows on her smooth brown skin, her lips slightly parted as if lost in thought. Phillips had told himself countless times that she was just a contract, an obligation, nothing more. But the more he tried to push her into that box, the more she slipped through his carefully built walls. And now, as another violent crack of thunder boomed through the mansion, followed by an eerie flicker of the chandelier, he noticed the slight shiver that ran through her petite frame. She was afraid. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning itself. Alika, who had remained composed, who had taken his coldness without protest, who had accepted her fate in this loveless marriage, was now trembling, her fingers gripping the fabric of the blanket tighter, her posture tense. Something in Phillips twisted, something primal, something unfamiliar. He told himself he didn't care. He told himself she could handle it. But the next flash of lightning illuminated her wide, frightened eyes, and before he could stop himself, he was moving. His body acted before his mind could protest, his steps soundless as he crossed the space between them, his presence looming over her before she even realized he was near. Alika blinked up at him in surprise, her lips parting as if to speak, but she never got the chance. Without a word, Phillips lowered himself onto the couch beside her, his movements controlled, calculated, as if he had not just broken one of his own unspoken rules. She stiffened slightly, her breath catching as he reached for the blanket, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest second before he pulled it from her grasp and draped it around both of them. The action was instinctual, a reaction he couldn't explain, but as the warmth of the thick fabric settled over his shoulders, Phillips felt an undeniable shift in the air. Alika's breath was soft, hesitant, her pulse fluttering at the base of her throat as she looked up at him, her expression unreadable. The fire crackled between them, casting golden hues across her face, and for the first time, Phillips allowed himself to study her. Her beauty was effortless, but it was more than that. There was a quiet strength in her, a softness that contradicted everything he had ever known, and it unnerved him how much he was drawn to it. "You're trembling," he murmured, his voice lower than he intended, rough from the weight of emotions he refused to name. Alika swallowed, her fingers tightening around the edges of the blanket. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her body betrayed her words, another involuntary shiver running through her. Phillips exhaled sharply, as if irritated, though whether it was with her or himself, he didn't know. Before he could think it through, before logic could override impulse, his arm moved on its own. Strong, unyielding, it wrapped around her small frame, pulling her against his side in a motion so natural, so effortless, that even he was shocked by it. Alika tensed for a split second, her entire body going rigid at the unexpected contact. But then, slowly, cautiously, she relaxed, the tension in her shoulders melting as she let herself lean into his warmth. And that was when Phillips realized his mistake. She fit against him too perfectly. The soft press of her body against his was intoxicating. Her scent, a delicate blend of jasmine and something uniquely her, invading his senses, making it impossible to think. He told himself this was only to keep her warm, that he would let go the moment she stopped trembling. But that moment never came. Because now the erratic pounding in his chest had nothing to do with the storm outside. It was her. Her warmth seeped through his shirt, her delicate frame fitting so perfectly into the crook of his arm that he couldn't look away. He felt the way her breath hitched, the slight shift of her body as she hesitated, as if unsure whether she was allowed to accept his warmth. And that hesitation made something deep inside him tighten, something he didn't understand, or maybe something he didn't want to understand. His grip around her instinctively tightened, his fingers curling against her arm in silent reassurance. "Go to sleep," he said, but his voice had lost its usual coldness, replaced by something softer, something almost protective. Alika didn't respond right away, but then, slowly, she nodded, resting her head lightly against his shoulder, her body molding against his side with a trust that he didn't deserve. Phillips stared into the fire, his jaw tense, his emotions warring inside him. He had spent years perfecting his indifference, mastering the art of keeping people at arm's length. And yet, with one small woman in his arms, he felt his carefully constructed walls begin to crack. This was dangerous. This feeling, this pull, this quiet ache deep in his chest, it was dangerous. Because if he let himself fall, there would be no going back. And yet, as Alika's breathing grew softer, her warmth becoming something he didn't want to let go of, Phillips knew the truth. He was already falling. Walls so high that no one could ever reach the man hidden beneath the ruthless billionaire exterior. But tonight, those walls were crumbling, and the woman responsible had no idea of the storm she was causing within him. The night was quiet, save for the distant hum of the city lights beyond the penthouse's glass walls, casting an ethereal glow over the luxurious bedroom, the skyline stretching endlessly like a sea of golden stars. He had returned late from a business meeting, expecting nothing but the usual cold silence of his world. Yet as soon as he stepped inside, the sight awaiting him made his breath catch, his pulse stuttering in a way that was utterly foreign to him. Alika stood near the edge of the bed, her delicate fingers lightly touching the silky fabric of the cream-colored gown she wore, the dim lighting accentuating the way the material clung to her curves in the softest, most unassuming way. It was nothing extravagant, nothing deliberately seductive, just a simple, modest silk gown that barely grazed her ankles. But on her, it was enough to make something inside Phillips snap. He was used to control. He was used to logic, to reason, to pushing down every flicker of emotion that dared to surface. But as his gaze roamed over her, over the innocence in her expression mixed with an unintentional allure that threatened to drive him mad, he couldn't move. He stood frozen in the doorway, his grip tightening on the cufflinks he had been in the process of removing, his breath locked in his throat as Alika turned to face him, her dark brown eyes blinking up at him with quiet curiosity. She had no idea. No idea what she was doing to him. No idea how dangerously close he was to crossing a line he had sworn he would never cross. He had spent weeks convincing himself that she was just a contract, just a woman he was bound to by circumstances, just someone he could keep at a distance without consequence. But now, with the soft glow of the bedside lamp illuminating the flawless brown skin of her shoulders, the delicate slope of her neck, and the way the silk barely concealed the gentle rise and fall of her chest, reason no longer existed. The air between them was thick, suffocating, charged with something unspoken yet undeniable, and for the first time in his life, Phillips couldn't fight it. His feet moved before his mind could stop them, carrying him forward in slow, deliberate steps, the sound of his polished shoes against the marble floor, the only thing breaking the silence. Alika didn't move away. She didn't shrink back, didn't cower under the intensity of his gaze. She simply stood there, watching him with those impossibly innocent eyes that made his restraint feel like a slowly unraveling thread. He stopped in front of her, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, close enough that he could hear the slight hitch in her breath as his fingers, as if moved by some unseen force, reached up on their own, brushing lightly against the exposed curve of her collarbone. The touch was barely there, a whisper of contact, yet it sent a bolt of electricity through him, igniting something dark, something uncontrollable. He saw the way Alika's lips parted, her lashes fluttering slightly as she inhaled shakily, her body betraying the very innocence that had drawn him in from the beginning. And that was when Phillips knew. This was dangerous. She was dangerous. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. His fingers trailed lower, skimming over the silk-covered curve of her shoulder, his touch slow, almost reverent, as if testing, as if daring himself to see how much further he could go before he lost himself completely. He could feel her tremble beneath his fingertips, see the way her breath shuddered as she tried to stay still. But the moment he dragged his knuckles lightly down her arm, her entire body betrayed her. A soft gasp escaping her lips, barely audible yet deafening in the silence between them. And that single sound shattered whatever restraint he had left. Without thinking, without hesitating, Phillips closed the distance, his hand sliding to the back of her neck as he tilted her face up to his own breath uneven, ragged, completely out of control. His gaze locked onto hers, searching, battling the war within him. But all he saw was her, soft and waiting, completely unaware of the monster she was awakening inside him. He was losing the fight. He was losing himself. His thumb brushed against her jaw, his grip firm yet hesitant, torn between the desire raging through his veins and the last thread of control keeping him from ruining her innocence forever. He shouldn't be doing this. He had told himself over and over that he would never touch her, that he would keep his distance, that he wouldn't give in to the pull she had over him. But now, standing this close, with her scent wrapping around him, with the silk of her gown teasing against his skin, with the way she was looking at him as if he was the only thing in her world, he was breaking. And then, finally, his resolve shattered. His lips brushed against hers. The contact was fleeting, barely there, but it was enough to make Phillips feel like the ground beneath him had disappeared. A sharp, electric jolt surged through him, something deeper, something more dangerous than he had ever felt before. And it terrified him. He ripped himself away, his breath harsh, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he turned his back to her, running a hand through his hair in frustration, in anger, at himself, at her, at whatever cruel force had placed her in his life to undo him so effortlessly. "Go to bed," he said hoarsely, his voice uneven, betraying the very battle he was trying to fight. Alika was silent, her body still, but he didn't dare look at her. He didn't dare see what he had just done to her, what he had just done to himself. Because if he did, if he met her gaze again, He wouldn't stop next time. He left the room without another word, slamming the door behind him, his pulse hammering so violently it hurt. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. And the worst part, he wanted to make it again. Morning came like a cruel reminder of the night before, and Phillips was not the type of man to lose control. He was a master of restraint, a man who dictated his emotions, not the other way around. Yet last night, he had been inches away from destroying all logic, all reason, all sense of who he was. And it was because of her. Alika. The name alone echoed in his mind, tormenting him, filling every empty space in his thoughts as he sat at the breakfast table, stiff and silent, his fingers clenched around the steaming cup of coffee he had no interest in drinking. Across from him she sat, delicate and graceful, completely unaware of the war she had ignited within him. She wasn't doing anything, just sipping her tea, her long lashes fluttering lightly as she read something on her phone. But the simple sight of her made his entire body coil with unbearable tension. He hated this. He hated the way his gaze kept drifting toward her without permission, the way the memory of last night's near kiss still burned on his lips like a curse he couldn't erase. It wasn't supposed to happen. It should have never happened. And yet, when he had been standing there, inches from her, breathing in her innocence, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath his fingertips, he had been completely undone. Weak. The very thought made him clench his jaw, his knuckles whitening against the cup, his frustration mounting like an uncontrollable storm inside him. This was why he had vowed never to let anyone close, because emotions were nothing but a distraction, a weakness, a leash dragging men into disaster. And now here he was, chained, bound to a feeling he couldn't understand, to a craving he couldn't control, and the only way to escape it was to do the one thing he had mastered all his life: shut down, distance himself, erase whatever last night had awakened. The decision was made before he even realized it. His chair scraped against the marble floor as he abruptly stood, causing Alika to look up at him, startled. Big mistake. Her eyes, those damn eyes, were soft and questioning, dark pools of innocence that made something ache deep inside him, something he didn't want to acknowledge. He looked away sharply, forcing himself to be unaffected, to be as cold as he had always been. "I'll be out the whole day," he said flatly, his voice void of emotion. "Don't wait for me." He didn't wait for her response. He didn't dare. He turned on his heel and left, each step away from her feeling heavier than the last, his body screaming at him, his mind cursing the weakness from last night. This is for the best. If he let himself get too close, if he let whatever this was grow, he would lose everything. The carefully built walls, the icy control, the power that had made him untouchable. She would destroy him. And yet, why did walking away feel like he was the one being destroyed? The office was supposed to be his sanctuary. It was where he was ruthless, where he was feared, where no one had the power to touch him. And yet, even here, she haunted him. As he sat at his desk, drowning himself in paperwork, in numbers, in meetings, she was there. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the way her breath had trembled against his lips last night, the way her pulse had fluttered beneath his touch, the way her scent had invaded his senses until he couldn't think of anything except kissing her. A curse left his lips as he threw his pen onto the desk, his frustration spiraling. This wasn't him. He wasn't the kind of man who got distracted. He wasn't the kind of man who let emotions rule him. And yet, here he was, suffering in silence, craving her like an addict, punishing himself for a desire he refused to name. "Sir?" His secretary's voice pulled him from his torment, and he blinked, realizing he had no idea what she had been saying. He was losing focus. He was losing himself because of her. "Cancel my meetings," he ordered abruptly, standing up, already feeling suffocated, already needing to run. He couldn't stay here. He needed space, distance, anything to rip himself away from whatever madness was clawing at him. But even as he drove away from the office, even as he let the city blur past him in streaks of neon lights, he couldn't escape her. Because when he finally returned home that night, exhausted and cold, determined to keep his distance, he stepped inside and saw her, smiling. She was laughing softly as she spoke to the housekeeper, her hands moving animatedly as she gestured, the light catching in her dark brown hair, making her look glowing, ethereal, so painfully beautiful it made his breath stop. And in that moment, it hit him. The reason he was so angry, so frustrated, so desperate to push her away, because he wanted her. Not just her body, her warmth, her laughter, the way she looked at him as if he wasn't the cold-hearted monster everyone else feared. He wanted her in a way he had never wanted anything before, in a way that terrified him to his core. And that was exactly why he had to stop this. He couldn't afford to let her win. He couldn't afford to let this feeling consume him. So, the next morning, he became even colder, even more distant. He avoided her at breakfast, leaving without a word. He stopped looking at her, stopped acknowledging her presence, stopped allowing himself to breathe her in. He told himself it was working, that he was regaining control, that he was winning. But the truth was, he was losing. Because the more he stayed away, the more he missed her. The more he avoided her, the more he ached for her. The more he convinced himself that he didn't need her, the more he realized that he did. And it was driving him absolutely insane. Alika stood in the middle of the grand bedroom, her hands trembling as she folded the last piece of clothing into her suitcase, her heart breaking with every movement. She had never imagined that this was how her marriage would turn out, a cold, empty bond where love had no place, where she was just a shadow in Phillips's life, lingering in the background while he kept his distance, refusing to even acknowledge her presence. She had tried so hard to be patient, to understand him, to believe that maybe, just maybe, he would one day look at her and see more than just the woman he had been forced to marry. But it was useless. He had made it clear, so painfully clear, that he didn't want her, didn't need her, didn't care if she stayed or left. And so she had finally made her decision. She would leave, even if it shattered her heart, even if walking away felt like tearing out a piece of her soul. She would not stay where she was not wanted. She zipped up her suitcase, swallowing against the lump in her throat, her vision blurring as she took one last look around the room that had been hers for months, yet had never felt like home. Because home wasn't a place. It was a feeling, a warmth, a love. And Phillips, he had never given her that. A deep breath shuddered through her as she grabbed the handle of her suitcase and turned toward the door, every step heavier than the last. "Goodbye, Phillips." The words echoed painfully in her mind as she reached for the doorknob, but before she could turn it, the door burst open. And there he was. Phillips stood in the doorway, his breathing harsh, his suit slightly disheveled as if he had been in a rush to get here, his dark eyes burning with something she had never seen before, something raw, something desperate. His gaze dropped to the suitcase at her side, and in an instant, something inside him snapped. No, she wasn't leaving. She couldn't. The mere thought of it sent a sharp, unbearable pain ripping through his chest, a feeling so foreign, so overwhelming that it left him breathless. His entire body tensed as he took a step forward, his voice low, strained, shaking with emotion. "Where do you think you're going?" Alika swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay strong, to ignore the way his presence still affected her, even after all the pain he had caused. "I'm leaving, Phillips," she said softly but firmly, her fingers tightening around the suitcase handle. "I can't do this anymore. I won't stay where I'm not wanted." His jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides, every muscle in his body wound like a live wire ready to snap. He didn't even think, he just moved. In an instant, he closed the distance between them, his hand wrapping around her wrist in a firm but gentle grip, his touch burning through her skin like fire. "You're not going anywhere." The words came out like a growl, low and possessive, filled with a desperation that shook him to his core. Alika's breath hitched as she looked up at him, her heart pounding at the intensity in his eyes. Why? Why was he stopping her now after ignoring her for so long? Why did he care now when he had acted like she meant nothing to him? "Let me go, Phillips," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but he only tightened his grip, his other hand coming up to tilt her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. No. The word was final, absolute, carrying a weight that made her chest tighten. "You belong to me, Alika." His voice was rough, strained, like he was barely holding himself together. "You are mine." Alika's lips parted in shock, her entire body freezing at his words. Mine. The way he said it, the way his eyes darkened with something she couldn't quite name, it sent a shiver down her spine, a warmth spreading through her chest despite herself. "You don't get to say that," she finally managed, her voice trembling with the emotions she had been holding back for so long. "You don't get to act like I matter to you now, Phillips. Not after everything." His grip on her wrist loosened slightly, but he didn't let go. He couldn't. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the abyss, knowing that if he let her walk away now, he would never recover. He would never be whole again. The realization struck him like a thunderbolt, leaving him raw, exposed, vulnerable in a way he had never been before. "You do matter to me," he admitted, his voice so low it was almost a whisper, yet filled with an intensity that made her heart stop. "More than I ever wanted to admit." Alika's eyes widened, her breath catching as she saw something in his gaze that she had never seen before. Fear. Not the fear of losing a business deal, not the fear of failure, but the fear of losing her. "Then why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why did you push me away? Why did you make me feel like I was nothing to you?" Phillips swallowed hard, his throat tightening, his walls crumbling. He had spent his entire life running from emotions, from attachments, from the one thing that could make a man weak: love. But as he stood here, staring into Alika's tear-filled eyes, feeling the heat of her skin beneath his touch, realizing how close he had come to losing her forever, he knew there was no more running, no more hiding, no more lies. He took a deep breath, his hands cupping her face now, his thumbs brushing away the silent tears that had escaped her eyes. "Because I was scared," he admitted, his voice raw, unguarded. "Because you make me feel things I don't understand, because you have the power to destroy me, and I didn't know how to handle that." Alika's heart clenched, her tears spilling freely now, because this was the man she had been waiting to see. Not the cold, ruthless billionaire, not the man who hid behind icy walls, but the real Phillips, the one who was flawed, vulnerable, afraid to love, yet unable to let her go. "Then stop pushing me away," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "If you really don't want to lose me, then fight for me." Phillips stared at her, his entire world shifting, something inside him breaking open. And then, without another word, he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly it felt like he was trying to fuse their souls together, as if letting go would be the end of him. "I won't let you go," he vowed, his voice shaking against her hair. "Never. You are mine, Alika, and I will never let you walk away again." For the first time in his life, Phillips Montgomery knew what it meant to fear losing something. And for the first time, he knew what it meant to fight for love. Phillips sat alone in his dimly lit study, his hands clenched into fists, his breathing uneven as the weight of his emotions bore down on him like an unstoppable storm. He had spent years mastering control, over his empire, over his actions, over his very thoughts. But tonight, he was losing that battle. Because tonight, the thought of Alika walking away, the image of her packing her bags, the crack in her voice as she had told him she couldn't do this anymore, haunted him in a way nothing ever had before. Why? Why did the idea of losing her make him feel like he was being ripped apart from the inside? Why did it feel like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss that terrified him more than anything else ever had? He didn't know. And that single truth made him feel powerless, a feeling he despised. He had told himself time and time again that Alika was just another part of the contract, another responsibility, nothing more. And yet, every time she smiled, every time she looked at him with those big, innocent eyes, every time she touched him, even the smallest touch, it felt like his entire world was tilting, pulling him towards something he had never wanted to feel. And now he couldn't escape it. His hands ran through his hair in frustration as he stood, abruptly, pacing the room, trying to reason with himself to regain control over the chaos raging inside him. But it was no use, because the truth was clear now. Alika had become everything, and he hated himself for not realizing it sooner. He didn't know how much time passed before he finally moved, before his feet carried him out of his study and down the long, silent hallways of the mansion. He didn't even realize where he was going until he found himself standing outside her bedroom door, his chest tightening painfully. His fingers curled into a fist, hovering above the door, his mind screaming at him to turn back, to leave her alone, to keep pretending he didn't care. But he did. And that was the problem. Taking a deep breath, he knocked, softly at first, then harder when there was no response. She was ignoring him, and somehow that hurt more than anything else. "Alika," he called out, his voice lower than usual, rough with an emotion he didn't dare name. "Open the door." Silence. A muscle ticked in his jaw as frustration curled in his chest, but underneath it there was something else. Desperation. He had never begged for anything in his life, never had to. But right now, if she didn't open this door, if she truly shut him out, he wasn't sure what he would do. And so, before he could stop himself, he spoke again, softer this time. "Please." The word felt foreign on his tongue, but it was real, raw. And then, finally, the door creaked open. Alika stood there, her expression unreadable, her eyes guarded in a way that made something sharp twist inside him. "What do you want, Phillips?" Her voice was quiet, but not weak, not broken. No, she was stronger now, and that realization made his throat tighten. He took a step closer, his hand gripping the doorframe, his pulse racing like a wild drumbeat against his ribs. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what the hell is happening to me, Alika. But I do know one thing, I can't let you go." A flash of pain crossed her face and she shook her head. That's not enough. And God, she was right, it wasn't. But it was all he had to give. For now. His hand came up before he could stop it, his fingers gently tilting her chin so she had no choice but to look at him. And when she did, something inside him broke. Because her eyes, those beautiful, deep, soulful eyes, were filled with pain. A pain he had caused, a pain that was his fault. His grip tightened ever so slightly, his thumb brushing against her soft skin, his breath uneven. "You changed me, Alika." The confession slipped from his lips before he could stop it, but he didn't want to take it back. It was the truth, the undeniable, terrifying truth. "I don't know how, I don't know why, but I can't stop thinking about you. I can't stop wanting you." His voice was raw, filled with something even he didn't understand. "And I don't know how to make it stop." Alika's breath hitched, her lashes fluttering as she stared up at him, searching his face for something, anything. And Phillips knew exactly what she was looking for, a reason to trust him, a reason to believe him. But could he give her that? Could he be the man she needed him to be? He didn't know. All he knew was that the thought of losing her was unbearable. And so, instead of speaking, instead of trying to find the right words, he did the only thing that made sense. He closed the distance between them, his forehead pressed against hers, his eyes closing as he breathed her in, as if she were the only thing keeping him grounded. "I'm trying," he murmured, his voice hoarse, his fingers trembling against her skin. "God help me, Alika, I'm trying." Her lips parted slightly, a soft exhale escaping her, and for a moment, just a moment, she let herself lean into him. Let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, he meant it. But then, just as quickly, she pulled away. Phillips felt the loss of her warmth like a physical ache, his entire body going tense as she took a step back. "Trying isn't enough," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not when you don't even know what you're feeling." And with that, she turned away, walking back into her room, leaving him standing there, alone, confused, and more lost than he had ever been in his life. Phillips exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair, his jaw clenching as frustration warred with something deeper, something terrifying. Love. Was that what this was? Was that what he had been fighting against all this time? Had he already lost the battle without even realizing it? His heart pounded violently as he took a shaky breath, his eyes locked on the closed door in front of him. This wasn't over. He wasn't letting her go. Not now. Not ever. Because Alika wasn't just someone who had entered his life by accident. She was his. His to protect. His to cherish. His to love. He just had to figure out how to prove it to her before it was too late. And for the first time in his life, Phillips Montgomery was willing to fight. For her, for them, for the love he had never wanted but could no longer deny. Phillips had spent his entire life controlling everything, his empire, his emotions, his desires. But as he stood there, staring at Alika, all of that control shattered. His breath came in uneven, shallow pulls as he watched her, every inch of his body drawn to her in ways he could no longer resist. She stood in front of him, her brown skin glowing under the soft golden light of the fireplace, her eyes filled with questions she was too afraid to ask. And yet, he could see it, the longing, the hesitation, the undeniable pull between them. It was too much. He had spent weeks, months pushing her away, convincing himself that he could fight this, fight her. But the truth was he had already lost. Because every time she smiled, every time she looked at him with those innocent, mesmerizing eyes, every time she unknowingly stole the breath from his lungs, she had been breaking down his walls, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but raw, aching need. And now, standing in this moment, Phillips knew there was no going back. Not tonight, not ever. He took a step forward, his pulse hammering, his fingers twitching at his sides as he fought the final remnants of his resistance. But it was useless. He didn't want control anymore. He didn't want the cold emptiness that had once been his comfort. He wanted her. Alika's breath hitched as he moved closer, her wide, nervous eyes locked onto his. He could see the confusion in them, the uncertainty, but not fear. She wasn't afraid of him. No, she was waiting, waiting for him to decide, waiting for him to stop lying to himself. His hands clenched, then relaxed as he exhaled sharply, his body trembling with the force of everything he had held back for so long. "Alika." His voice was hoarse, thick with an emotion he still didn't fully understand, but it didn't matter, because she understood. He could see it in the way her lips parted, in the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides, in the way she took the smallest step toward him, as if she too could no longer resist. That was all it took, that one small step. It was his undoing. With a growl of surrender, Phillips closed the distance between them, his hands cupping her face, his fingers threading into her soft hair as he crashed his lips against hers. And just like that, everything changed. The moment their lips met, the fire that had been simmering between them for so long exploded. Phillips kissed her like a man starved, like someone who had been dying of thirst and had finally found water. He kissed her as if he had been waiting his entire life for this moment. And maybe he had. His grip tightened, pulling her closer, molding her soft body against his harder one as his lips moved hungrily against hers, tasting, devouring, losing himself completely. A deep, primal sound rumbled in his chest as her fingers hesitantly slid up his arms, resting against his shoulders, her touch so soft, so gentle, it sent a shudder down his spine. She was everything he had ever feared and everything he had ever wanted, and he couldn't fight it anymore. He wouldn't. His hands roamed, tracing the delicate line of her jaw, memorizing the silkiness of her skin, branding every single inch of her into his soul. "Damn it, Alika," he muttered against her lips, his voice breaking as he pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. Those eyes. God, they were undoing him. Dark, deep, innocent, yet filled with the desire that matched his own. His thumb brushed over her lower lip, swollen from his kiss, and he felt his restraint snap into nothingness. "I can't fight this anymore," he admitted, his voice raw with desperation. "I don't want to." And before she could respond, before she could pull away or question his sudden surrender, he kissed her again, deeper this time. It wasn't just a kiss. It was everything. It was weeks of tension, months of denial, years of control unraveling in an instant. Phillips poured everything into it. The frustration, the passion, the aching need that had been clawing at him from the moment he had first laid eyes on her. "And Alika," she responded. With a soft gasp, she melted against him, her fingers gripping his shirt as if she were afraid to let go. He groaned at the way she fit against him so perfectly, at the warmth of her, at the way her scent wrapped around him, driving him to madness. He deepened the kiss, tilting her head back, his fingers sliding down her arms, leaving trails of fire in their wake. She was intoxicating, more addicting than anything he had ever known. And he knew in that moment that there was no turning back. This wasn't just desire, it wasn't just need. It was her. It had always been her. And now there was no force in the world strong enough to make him let her go, not even himself. His lips left hers only to trail down her jaw, his breath hot against her skin as he whispered, "You're mine." The words were possessive, raw, filled with an emotion he wasn't ready to name, but he meant them. More than anything else in his life, he meant them. Alika shivered, her hands fisting in his shirt, and he knew. She felt it too. The undeniable pull, the unbreakable bond that had formed between them, long before either of them had acknowledged it. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze, his thumb caressing her cheek as he studied her expression. "Tell me to stop, and I will," he murmured, his voice husky, his body thrumming with restraint. Because this wasn't just about him. It was about her, about what she wanted, about what she felt. Alika stared at him for a long moment, her breathing ragged, her heart pounding against his chest. And then, with the softest of whispers, she answered, "Don't stop." The last thread of Phillips's control snapped. With a deep, shuddering exhale, he lifted her into his arms, carrying her across the room as his lips found hers again, sealing them in a kiss so deep, so consuming, it left them both breathless. He laid her down gently, his fingers tracing the contours of her face, memorizing her. And as he looked into her eyes, as he saw the trust, the longing, the love she had been holding back for so long, something inside him shifted. This wasn't just passion. This wasn't just surrender. This was everything. And he wasn't just losing himself in her. He was finding himself, finding a part of him he never knew existed, a part that belonged to her and her alone, forever. Phillips had built an empire with cold precision, ruling the business world with an iron fist, crushing anyone who dared to stand in his way. He had never feared anything, not losses, not betrayals, not even threats. He had always been in control, always calculated, always untouchable. But now, for the first time in his life, he was drowning in a fear so raw, so consuming, it made his heart pound against his ribs with a force that almost shattered him. Alika was gone. His Alika, his wife, the woman who had undone him, who had melted his cold heart, who had made him feel things he never thought himself capable of feeling. And now someone had dared to take her away from him. Someone had dared to steal what was his. The moment the call had come, his entire world had stopped. The chilling voice on the other end had sent ice through his veins. "If you want her alive, you'll listen carefully." It was an old enemy, someone Phillips had destroyed years ago. He hadn't cared back then. He had crushed him like all the others, left him ruined and forgotten. But now that past had come back for revenge, and they had taken the only thing in this world that truly mattered to him. Alika. His hands trembled as he clenched the phone, his entire body rigid with fury. He was not a man who begged. He was not a man who negotiated. But for her, he would burn the world down if he had to. "If you hurt her," his voice came out dark, deadly, a promise of destruction. "I will hunt you to the ends of the earth and make you wish for death." The laughter on the other end made his vision blur with rage. They thought they had won. They thought he would be weak now because they had found his weakness. But they had made the gravest mistake of their lives. Because Phillips wasn't just any man. He wasn't just any billionaire. He was a man willing to become a monster for the woman he loved. Without wasting another second, he stormed out of his office, barking orders to his men. "Find her. Now!" His private security, his most trusted people scattered, moving at lightning speed, tracking every possible lead. But it wasn't enough. Phillips couldn't just sit and wait, not when every passing second felt like a knife carving into his soul. His mind raced through possibilities, his heart hammering with a panic he couldn't contain. Was she afraid? Was she crying? Was she calling out for him? The thought of Alika being scared, being hurt, being alone in the hands of those monsters, it was unbearable. His fists slammed against the glass of his penthouse window. The reflection staring back at him was one of a man he barely recognized, a man who was losing control. And then, finally, a lead. One of his men rushed in, breathless. "We found them. A warehouse outside the city." Phillips didn't wait. He didn't ask for details. He didn't care about plans or strategies. He was going. His men tried to stop him, but he was beyond reasoning. "Sir, it's dangerous." He didn't care. "Get the damn car." His voice was like steel, his eyes burning with a fury that could destroy cities. If Alika was in danger, then there was no force in this world that could stop him from reaching her. The drive to the warehouse was a blur. Phillips sat in the back seat, his fingers twitching, his mind spiraling with dark thoughts. What if he was too late? The fear clawed at him, but he shoved it down. He wouldn't be too late. He refused to be. As soon as they reached the location, he was out of the car, his men flanking him, weapons ready. But Phillips didn't wait for them. He stormed in first, his fury leading the way. The warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with the stench of oil and dust. And then he heard it, a muffled cry, "Alika." His heart nearly stopped. She was here, she was alive, and that was all that mattered. Without hesitation, Phillips moved like a predator, his steps silent, his focus razor-sharp. The men guarding her never saw him coming. The first one dropped before he could even react, Phillips's fist connecting with his jaw with bone-crushing force. The second reached for his gun, but Phillips was faster. A single punch to the throat and he collapsed. And then he saw her. tied to a chair, her brown skin streaked with tears, her eyes wide with fear. But the moment she saw him, something changed. Relief, trust, love. Phillips. Her voice was broken, weak, but it was all he needed to hear. In 2 strides, he was in front of her, his hands cupping her face, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "Did they hurt you?" His voice was soft now, shaking with emotions he didn't know how to control. She shook her head, but the tears kept falling. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. And just like that, something inside him shattered. She had believed in him. Even in the darkest moment, she had never doubted him. Without thinking, he crushed her into his arms, holding her so tight it was as if he was trying to fuse them together. Because he couldn't let go. Not now. Not ever. "You're safe now," he murmured against her hair. "I've got you." But the moment of tenderness was brief, because the man who had taken her was still standing there, smirking. "I knew she was important to you," he sneered. "You finally have something to lose." Something inside Phillips snapped. He let go of Alika, turning to face the man who had dared to touch her, dared to threaten her, dared to think he could take her away. There were no words, just pure, unrelenting rage. In a single movement, Phillips lunged, his fists connecting with brutal force. The man stumbled, blood spilling from his lip, but Phillips wasn't done. He had hurt Alika, and for that he would pay. The fight was quick, ruthless. Phillips didn't hold back. Every punch, every blow was fueled by something deeper than rage. Love. The kind of love that made him merciless, that made him willing to destroy anything that threatened to take her from him. By the time it was over, the man was barely conscious, and Phillips stood over him, breathing heavily, his knuckles stained with blood. "If you ever come near her again," his voice was dark, deadly, a promise of hell, "I will personally end you." The man whimpered, nodding weakly. Phillips didn't look at him again. He turned back to Alika, and the moment he saw her, still trembling, still looking at him with those eyes that had tamed him, all his fury melted. Without another word, he lifted her into his arms, cradling her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, because she was. "Let's go home," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. And as she buried her face against his chest, clutching onto him like he was her entire world, Phillips knew one thing for certain. No matter what it took, he would protect her. Always. Phillips had always been a man of control, a man who dictated the fate of industries, who crushed competitors with a single command, who had never bowed to anyone or anything. But now he was a man possessed, driven by nothing but the sheer, unrelenting need to find Alika and destroy anyone who had dared to touch her. The rage inside him was blinding, a force stronger than anything he had ever known, but beneath that fury lay something even more dangerous: fear. A fear so deep, so consuming, that it made every second without her feel like a dagger twisting in his chest. His men had found the location where they were keeping her, a rundown hideout on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by nothing but darkness. It didn't matter. Phillips didn't wait for a plan, didn't wait for backup. He was going in, and he would burn the entire place down if that's what it took to bring her back. His car screeched to a halt outside the hideout, and before his guards could say a word, he was already out, his long strides carrying him forward with deadly precision. He was not the billionaire tonight. He was not the ruthless businessman. He was a man whose heart had been stolen by a woman he never expected to love, and now that love was on the line. The moment he kicked the door open, all hell broke loose. Gunshots rang out, but Phillips didn't stop. He moved like a storm, his sharp eyes cutting through the dimly lit space, searching for the only thing that mattered: Alika. His men were right behind him, taking down the guards, but Phillips barely registered any of it. Then he saw her, tied to a chair, her hands bound, her face pale, but her eyes, those beautiful, innocent eyes, lit up the moment they landed on him. "Phillips," she breathed, her voice weak but full of relief, full of trust. He had never felt his heart beat so violently, so painfully as it did in that moment. She was alive. She was right there, just a few feet away, but she wasn't safe yet. Before he could move, one of the kidnappers grabbed her, pressing a knife to her throat. Phillips froze, his entire body going rigid, his blood turning ice cold. "Stay back, or she dies," the man sneered. Phillips had never known fear like this. He had always thought he was invincible, untouchable. But now the woman he loved was at the mercy of another man, and for the first time in his life, he felt powerless. But only for a second, because the moment the blade grazed Alika's delicate skin, something inside him snapped. "Let her go," he growled, his voice low, dangerous, a promise of death. The man smirked, thinking he had the upper hand. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Phillips took a step forward, slow, deliberate, his eyes locked onto Alika's. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was looking at him with complete trust. And that trust fueled something in him, something darker, something lethal. In one swift move, Phillips struck. He lunged forward, knocking the man's hand away from Alika, his other fist connecting with the man's jaw with a sickening crack. The knife clattered to the ground, and before the man could react, Phillips was on him, raining down blows, his vision blurred with rage. How dare he? How dare he touch her? How dare he make her afraid? The only thing that stopped him from killing the man right there was Alika's soft voice. "Phillips, please." That one word, that single plea, broke through his fury. He turned to her, his breathing ragged, his hands shaking. And then, without another thought, he was pulling her into his arms, crushing her against his chest, holding her so tightly it was as if he was afraid she would disappear. "You're safe now," he murmured against her hair, his voice thick with emotions he didn't know how to handle. He had never held someone like this. He had never needed someone like this. I thought I'd never see you again," she whispered, her voice trembling, her hands clutching onto his shirt as if he was the only thing keeping her grounded. He pulled back just enough to cup her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek, his eyes dark with something raw, something unbreakable. "I will never let you go," he vowed, his voice rough, desperate. "Not now. Not ever." And then, before he could stop himself, before he could think about anything else, he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't soft. It was a kiss full of desperation, full of love, full of everything he had been too afraid to admit. She was his to protect, his to love, his to cherish. And he had almost lost her. The thought made him hold her even tighter, made him swear that he would never let anything like this happen again. That night, back in their penthouse, Phillips didn't leave her side. He refused to. Alika sat on the bed, wrapped in his shirt, her fingers intertwined with his. She was exhausted, but she wasn't broken. She was stronger than anyone he had ever known, and she was his. "You should sleep," he murmured, brushing his fingers through her hair. She shook her head, her eyes searching his. "Are you okay?" That question, that simple question, undid him. She had been the one kidnapped, the one in danger, and yet here she was worrying about him. Phillips let out a shaky breath, leaning his forehead against hers. "I thought I lost you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I'd go insane if I didn't get to you in time." She smiled softly, reaching up to touch his face. "But you did." And that was it. That was all that mattered. She was here. She was safe. And she was his forever. That night, Phillips didn't sleep. He held her close, his arms wrapped around her, his lips pressed to her forehead, whispering words he had never thought he would say. "I love you." The words felt foreign on his tongue, but they were the truth. He loved her. More than anything, more than himself, more than the entire world. And he would spend the rest of his life proving it to her. Phillips had built an empire with ruthless precision, tearing through industries, shattering rivals, and bending the world to his will. Yet standing before Alika now, all that power, all that control felt insignificant compared to the way she looked at him. She had been the one thing he never expected, the one thing that changed everything, the one who had melted the ice around his heart with nothing but her innocence, her kindness, and her unwavering belief in him. He had spent his life thinking love was a weakness, a distraction, something that made men foolish. But now, as he watched her move around their penthouse, as he saw her smile, soft and radiant, just for him, he knew the truth. Love wasn't weakness. It was the only thing that had ever made him feel alive. And he would dedicate every breath, every moment, to proving that to her. From the moment he had rescued her, something inside him had shifted, something irreversible, something terrifying in its intensity. Alika was his world now, and nothing, no past, no fear, no hesitation, would ever stand between them again. He was no longer just the ruthless billionaire, no longer just the cold, unfeeling man who ruled from the top of an ivory tower. He was hers. He spent every waking moment making up for the time he had been distant, for every second he had pushed her away. The man who had once refused to acknowledge his own heart now spent his days memorizing the details of her happiness. What made her laugh? What made her blush? What made her eyes sparkle with joy? He no longer buried himself in endless work, no longer shut himself away in boardrooms while his heart ached for something he had been too stubborn to admit. Now he worked only to ensure she never had to worry about a thing. He showered her with affection, with whispered promises in the dead of night, with soft touches that lingered as if he could never get enough of her. He had never been a man of grand romantic gestures, but for Alika, he became one. Their mornings were slow, filled with breakfast in bed and stolen kisses, with Phillips pressing his lips to her forehead as she sleepily mumbled his name, with his arms wrapped around her waist as he refused to let her leave the warmth of their bed. And their nights, oh, their nights, were endless. He held her as if she were the most precious thing in existence, worshipped her with a tenderness that shocked even himself. But it wasn't just about spoiling her with riches, though he did that too, unable to resist the urge to see her eyes light up whenever he presented her with something beautiful. It was in the little things. It was in the way he learned to cook just because she once mentioned wanting homemade meals, in the way he canceled meetings to take her on surprise dates, in the way he held her hand in public, proudly, possessively, letting the world know she belonged to him. It was in the way he listened, truly listened to her, learning her dreams, her fears, her desires. The once detached billionaire who had scoffed at the idea of love now spent hours simply talking to her, losing himself in her voice, in the way she made even the simplest things feel magical. And when she fell asleep in his arms, her fingers curled into his shirt as if she never wanted to let go. He knew he would never be the same man he once was. He had been feared in the business world, a man known for his ruthless efficiency, for his merciless decisions. Now he was feared for an entirely different reason. Now he was a man who would burn the world down for the woman he loved, a man whose devotion ran so deep it made his enemies wary. Because anyone who even dared to think of harming Alika knew one thing: Phillips would destroy them without hesitation. He had once believed that power meant control, that strength meant never allowing emotions to rule him. But now, as he pressed a kiss to Alika's bare shoulder, as she shivered in his arms and whispered his name like a prayer, he realized love was the greatest power of all, and he would wield it with the same intensity he had once reserved for his empire. One evening, as they stood on the balcony, watching the city lights flicker like stars beneath them, Alika turned to him, her brown eyes filled with something so soft, so unguarded, that it made his chest tighten. "You're different," she whispered, reaching up to brush her fingers against his jaw. He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm yours," he corrected softly. "That's all I've ever wanted to be." And in that moment he knew. There was no going back. The ruthless billionaire was gone. In his place stood a man hopelessly, irrevocably, desperately in love. Phillips had never imagined that love could consume him so completely, that the cold-hearted billionaire he once was could become a man so deeply devoted, so endlessly obsessed with the woman who had turned his world upside down. But Alika had done just that. She had broken through every wall he had ever built, not with force, not with demands, but simply by being herself, pure, innocent, breathtakingly beautiful, and filled with a love so deep it made him feel like he had been starved for an entire lifetime before she came into his world. And now, as their anniversary approached, Phillips knew he had to do something extraordinary. It wasn't enough to tell her how much he loved her. He had to show her, in a way that would leave no doubt, in a way that would make her heart race the way she made his race every single day. So he planned something that would be imprinted in their memories forever, something that would prove to Alika that no matter how much time passed, no matter how many years they spent together, his love for her would only grow stronger, deeper, more consuming. On the evening of their anniversary, Phillips led Alika to a private jet, refusing to tell her where they were going. She laughed, the sound soft and sweet, the way it always was when he surprised her. But there was a light in her brown eyes, a curiosity, a trust and excitement that made his heart tighten with emotions he had never known before her. He couldn't help but steal kisses on the flight, couldn't help but hold her close, his fingers threading through hers as he whispered promises against her skin. And when they finally landed, when he carried her off the plane and she saw the paradise he had brought her to, Alika gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as she turned in slow circles, taking in the breathtaking view. A private island, untouched and serene, surrounded by the most beautiful crystal-clear waters, with a villa built just for them, a place where only their love existed, where no world, no business, no responsibilities could touch them. She turned to him, eyes wide, voice breathless. "You did this? For me?" And the way she said it, as if she still couldn't believe how much he adored her, made Phillips feel something break inside him all over again. He cupped her face, his thumb brushing against her cheek, his voice low, raw. "For you. Always for you." That night, he didn't let her out of his sight. He watched her as she walked along the shore, the moonlight casting a silver glow on her skin, making her look ethereal, like a dream he never wanted to wake up from. He trailed after her, pulled her into his arms, and kissed her slow, deep, savoring every second as the ocean waves lapped at their feet. "I have something for you," he murmured against her lips, his voice husky, filled with emotions he no longer tried to suppress. Alika blinked up at him, her brown eyes filled with love, with trust, with the kind of softness that made him want to spend an eternity worshipping her. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and, before she could react, he went down on one knee. Alika gasped, her hands flying to her chest, her breath catching as she stared at him in shock. "Phillips." But he didn't let her speak. Not yet. Because this moment, this confession, had been in his heart for too long, and he needed her to hear it. "I married you for a contract," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I thought it was just business. I thought I would remain the same ruthless man, untouched, unmoved. But then you..." He swallowed, his grip on the ring box tightening. "You changed everything, Alika. You changed me. I didn't even realize when it happened, but now, I can't imagine a single day without you." Alika's lips parted, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, but she stayed silent, letting him continue. Phillips took a deep breath, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the overwhelming love he felt for this woman. "I never got down on one knee when we first married," he admitted, his jaw clenching. "I never asked you properly, and I regret that because you deserve everything. You deserve the world, Alika." He opened the box, revealing a ring more stunning than any jewel he had ever bought for her. A diamond so flawless, so radiant, it paled in comparison to the way she looked at him. "So tonight, I'm asking you, not as the man you married, not as the billionaire who once thought love was nothing but a foolish game, but as the man who is hopelessly, irrevocably in love with you." His voice dropped to a whisper, raw with sincerity. "Marry me again, Alika. Not for a contract, not for business, but because I can't breathe without you, because I will love you for every lifetime to come." Alika's tears spilled over, but her smile, God, her smile, was brighter than anything he had ever seen. She didn't wait, didn't hesitate. She threw herself into his arms, knocking him back into the sand, laughing through her tears as she whispered over and over again, "Yes, yes, yes." And Phillips kissed her like a man who had found his salvation. The waves crashed around them, the stars above witnessing a love so deep, so all-consuming, it felt like it had been written in fate itself. And as he held her, as he slipped the ring onto her finger and claimed her lips again, Phillips knew this was forever. Not because of a contract, not because of circumstance, but because there was no version of his life that didn't belong to her. Years would pass, but nothing would change. He would still be obsessed, still be hers, still be the man who woke up every day just to make her smile. And as they lay beneath the moonlight, tangled together, lost in each other, Phillips whispered the only truth that had ever mattered. "You are my world, Alika, and I will love you for eternity."